Hi, I'm Mary.
And I'm Katie, and this is The Housewife Did It.
True Crime Edition. Welcome to our amateur podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
That we do not get paid for,
right.
where we do
But,
not have a research team.
right. Um, but if you like it, you can share it, promote it, review, all of those things. And then we can make money for it and we can hire a research team and maybe you will be more pleased with our work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a little moment to say that in controversial cases and in older cases, and honestly in any case, because we're flawed people who work full-time jobs
Right.
and do all of this on our own, we're gonna miss stuff and we're gonna get stuff wrong and we're gonna not be able to find every source. We're also not gonna be able to discuss every source because we don't want to make these 12 hours long.
Not gonna be able to confirm every
Because
source with the
we have
people
to
who are
sleep.
there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So when you hang with us, just know like we're just talking about these cases and like talking about what we found and like we would love for you to tell us if you've seen other sources. But don't expect us to get it right all the time.
Yeah. I don't have a real time true crime, but there is a true crime thing kind of trending right now. Um or like going viral, I guess. So there's a Netflix documentary out now called Tell Them You Love Me, which has blown up quite a bit on TikTok. And basically, I think the reason it has blown up is because of the inclusion of the convicted sex offender in this case as an interviewee in the documentary, um and not from jail. Like they're interviewing her in her home and letting her just say whatever she wants about it. But so basically the documentary is about a man named Derek that has cerebral palsy, and his brother, when his brother was getting his doctoral degree, helped him get involved in an assisted speech program because he was nonverbal. um and basically, like, what that means is that he would like type things he wanted to say. um and so he had someone who, this allowed him to like go to college. He had someone who would help him take notes or speak in class, or and it was really like the first time he was able to even like write things, um because he had like limited motor functions. But so another thing is that the people who were helping him with the assisted speech were moving his hands to help him type things. And one of the women he was working with claimed that they began a relationship that eventually became physical, and that this started through their conversations with him typing messages to her and her responding. And she said that they agreed to tell his family, and when they did, his mom took it to the police because she claimed that he would not have had the capacity to form a romantic relationship, and especially not to consent to sex. And um the reason I'm giving you all of that information up front is because people have said that it was very triggering to watch it, not knowing exactly what it was about. But I watched it and it is like infuriating in a way that I feel like true crime people like to be infuriated. Like you watch it and you're like, what the fuck? Like, hate her, mad about it. But yeah, so it's a good documentary, but it's all that's on my TikTok right now. Because there are a lot of things that she says that are very frustrating, and it's sad also.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you haven't watched that, You can. I'm not recommending it or not recommending it because it is what it is. But so now we'll jump into my case. I have a content warning
Surprise, surprise.
for child abuse and neglect. Severe child abuse and neglect. So I'm going to begin with a quote. It
Wow.
says, yes, this is an essay. Quote, "The few children known to scientists who did not learn to speak in early childhood were almost totally isolated from other people during their critical early years. Neither recovered normal language function later in life." End quote. This is from my grad school textbook. Allow me, it's right here.
Wait.
It's from the
Nice.
letters manual.
Nice.
Sammy said, "No one's going to know what the letters manual is." I said, okay, I'll show them. So I read it and I was like, okay, bonus episode. Immediately interested in that. And then I started looking at information on this and I was like, oh, okay, full length episode. My bad. There's so much. So that's what we're gonna talk about today. Historically, these children that we're gonna talk about are known as feral children. But we now call them linguistically deprived children. And I'm going to tell you about one of the most famous cases of a linguistically deprived child, but I'm also going to tell you some of the other things. Why is that funny?
It's just funny.
Because there's a politically correct term for feral children.
No, it's just funny that you are going to continue with linguistically deprived.
Because that's what she was.
Right, but like in the case of like society and whatever, like this is the first case of like a feral child.
It's not the first case of a feral child. It's actually.
I'm just saying it's whatever you just said. The whatever we're going to talk about a case of. I'm saying like socially speaking, like
It's the
whatever.
most
But
modern case of a feral child. All right. In October of 1970, Dorothy Irene Wiley got into a violent argument with her husband Clark, which ended in her walking out with their 13-year-old daughter Susan, who goes by Genie for the remainder of this story, and taking her to her parents' home in Monterey Park, California. Dorothy and Clark had an 18-year-old son who I'm going to call Davis. I don't know his name, and that one called to me, so. But Davis had recently run away from home and was now living with some friends. Dorothy, who went by Irene, was a single mother for the first time and in desperate need of support for herself and her daughter. So she made her way to the Disability Services Department in nearby Temple City, where she was hoping to be able to get disability payments for her severe nearsightedness. She had very bad nearsighted. How bad, you're wondering? Let me tell you. Her vision was so bad that Irene accidentally made her way into the social services office next door, where a social worker took one look at her daughter Jeannie and knew something was very wrong.
understood.
That kind of funny.
They might call that blindness at a certain point.
It was like, I think they said it was like degenerative eye condition. So Susan Wiley, who is known in media history as Genie, was born in 1957 by C-section with no complications. She seemed healthy other than needing a blood transfusion, which was successful, so all good. At her 3-month checkup, doctors found that Jeannie had a congenital hip dislocation, but was otherwise progressing nicely. Because of the dislocation, Jeannie needed to wear a corrective brace until she was almost a year old, which meant she would be late to walk. But they're like, we need to fix this. That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
After getting this news, Jeannie's father decided that there was something wrong with her. He was like, I'm not going to have a special needs child.
Mm-hmm.
And so he decided to actively ignore her
Okay.
as at 3 months old and encouraged his wife and son to do the same. Clark did not like children and never wanted them, but Genie was actually Clark and Irene's fourth child. Their first child, a girl, had died at 10 weeks old after Clark became disturbed by her crying and left her overnight in the garage where she caught a fatal case of pneumonia.
Nice.
And
Great.
their second child, a boy, died at 2 days old from a combination of complications with RH incompatibility,
Yep.
and choking on his own mucus, which I think is something that comes with RH incompatibility. Um, Davis and Genie also had RH incompatibility, but it was treated successfully with blood transfusions, and I think that's because they knew that the first boy had it. They were able to catch it early and treat it. So that's why Jeannie had a blood transfusion right after she was born, but it was successful and they were fine.
Mm-hmm.
When it was time for Jeannie to get the brace off, doctors found that Jeannie had dropped from the 50th percentile for weight to the 11th percentile, signaling some signs of malnutrition, which her mom credited to her refusal to eat solid food.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, she's what? How old is she now? Like a year old. They make non-solid food for babies that age
Yeah.
that supplement them. Whatever. Um, 3 months later, Jeannie became ill with a fever and was diagnosed with pneumonitis. The pediatrician who saw her for this illness suggested that she may also have a neurological disability called kernicterus. I did look up how to say these, which is categorized as a brain dysfunction brought on by bilirubin. Bilirubin?
Bilirubin.
Bilirubin? Okay. Brought on by bilirubin, which does occur naturally in the body. Everyone has it, but it can be toxic at abnormally high levels, and when it gets to abnormally high levels, can cause brain damage and central nervous system damage.
Mm-hmm.
So hearing this was confirmation to Clark that his child had special needs and that she was going to be more trouble than she was worth. When Jeannie was about a year and a half old, Davis was on a walk with their paternal grandmother when she was killed in a hit and run. This was devastating to their father, and he immediately blamed Davis for his mother's death. Clark had had a complicated relationship with his mother. His father, this is like bonkers to me. What are the odds? His father died of a lightning strike.
Who?
And
Clark's father?
yeah, and then his mom died in a hit and run.
Wow.
That's a lot. But so when he was a child, his father had died of a lightning strike. So he was raised by his mother as a single mother. And for work, she ran a brothel. So she was frequently away from home, getting her bag, running her business. Um, he also took issue with his mother because he said that it was her fault he was picked on as a child because she had given him a feminine name. I don't know what it was. When he grew up, he changed it to Clark.
Oh, okay.
So, and once he changed his name, his mother began to come around more and they formed a better relationship. She
She
quickly,
also thought he had a feminine name?
she said, fuck your name. No, I think it was because he was an adult now.
Okay.
And so I think that
Him and his
there
mom might be
wasn't,
similar in that they did not want children.
well, I just think that like there's a different there's a difference in like your parent not being around for you when they are your caretaker and you're a
Yeah.
child and dependent on them, and then like when you're older and they can like visit but aren't responsible for you. I think is he was like, okay. um she quickly became the most important person in his life. which is why he became absolutely incensed when the driver that had killed her only received probation. Soon after his mother's death, Clark quit his job and moved his family into his mother's house, where he, full Ed Gein style, determined that her bedroom and car would be off limits as a way to honor her. And he completely isolated his family there. Genie was only 20 months old at the time, and as soon as they moved in, she was kept in a locked room where she was typically strapped to a training toilet or bound in a crib with her arms and legs immobilized in a makeshift straitjacket.
Mm.
Clark would not allow anyone to interact with her. She was unable to move, and she was malnourished for the rest of the time she lived with her parents. Clark claimed he was protecting her from the world because of what he perceived as her disabilities, but after she met the social worker in 1970 and became a ward of the state, the truth of Jeannie's extreme abuse and neglect would come to light. When this social worker at the Social Security office first saw Genie, she guessed by her size, stature, and mannerisms that she was likely about 6 or 7 years old and autistic, which I feel like is a crazy assumption for the 70s. Did they have
Yeah.
autistic people in the 70s?
Yes, they did have them. Mm-hmm.
Um, However, when her mother admitted that Jeannie was almost 14 years old, the social worker immediately called the police and Irene was taken away. It was clear that Jeannie had been mistreated, but they weren't going to be able to get the details from Jeannie herself as she still had not learned to speak. Luckily, Jeannie's father kept detailed notes of his abuse of his
Oh,
family in a
oh,
journal.
so smart.
Thank you, Clark.
Mm-hmm.
With one of the two bedrooms in their home sanctioned off as a shrine to his mother, Clark had turned the other bedroom into a jail cell for Jeannie and used the living room as a studio apartment for the rest of the family. They
Rude.
lived in a 2-bedroom home as a family of 4, and he
She
had them
got her own
living
room.
all in the living room. Mm-hmm.
You hate this kid so much, but she got her own room.
Early in the move, he would allow Jeannie to play in a playpen outside, albeit unsupervised. But when Jeannie began to break down the playpen and get out into the yard, Clark no longer allowed her out of the room.
When she started to develop motor skills.
He was like, here's my question. Why don't you just let her walk off? If you don't like her so much, let
Yeah.
someone else find her. Um, Instead, Jeannie would spend approximately 13 hours a day tied to a child's toilet using a harness Irene had made.
What about the other hours?
I'm gonna get to them. Um, she was made to only wear a diaper and was tied so tightly with the harness that she could only move her hands and her feet. At night, if Jeannie wasn't left to sleep on the small plastic toilet, she would be tied into a sleeping bag with her arms and legs confined and placed into a crib with a metal screen cover on top. I'm like, picture like a terrarium and like the metal screen that goes on top of a
Mm-hmm.
terrarium. Yeah. If Jeannie made any sort of noise, Clark would beat her with a large plank and then growl at her like a dog. He grew his fingernails out to be able to scratch Jeannie with like a cat. If she did something she wasn't supposed to do, he would sit outside of her room and make dog and cat noises at her until
Now
she stopped.
that is feral. And it's like, is he aware? Like it almost feels like he's like being strategic in like, I don't want her to hear human language. So I'm just, but it's like, surely he's not thinking like that far ahead, right? That like he doesn't want her to learn to speak. Like, you know what I mean?
I think he just wanted everyone to ignore her. But also, like,
Yeah, but I'm saying like you don't even like
we're
scream
gonna
at
get to
her when
why
you're
he
mad at
doesn't
her.
want her to speak.
Okay. So it is the dog and cat thing like is purposeful?
Yeah.
So this is like an intelligent guy? in like some way that he like thought ahead that like she won't develop verbal abilities if we don't speak in front of her?
I don't think it's like that deep. I think he just didn't want her to make noise. And so he was
Yeah.
like, let's just not, nobody make noise.
But he did make noise, just not human noise.
Yeah, he was allowed to make noise.
No, I know. I'm just saying it seems like that would almost be like strategic because in the end
Yeah.
what happens is that like if you're linguistically deprived, you don't learn the English
Yeah.
language, you don't learn to talk, and so it's just like, oh man, if he had screamed at her and berated her, she maybe would have learned to talk. But
Yeah.
instead he was weird and he growled like a dog.
I don't know. I know that he was trying to get her to be afraid of cats and dogs so that when he sat outside of
Okay.
the room and made cat and dog noises, she would like shut up.
Okay, sure.
But
I see.
Clark only fed Genie baby food or pablum, which is a baby cereal from the 50s. Like, like baby cereal is like porridge, pretty much. Sometimes she would have soft boiled eggs or liquids, but he fed her as little as possible. He refused to allow Irene to feed her, although she later claimed she would sneak into Jeannie's room many nights around 11 p.m. and give her food in secret. They kind of confirmed this because when she was like rescued, she would wake up every night around 11 p.m. They noticed, so they thought maybe that is true. On days where Clark was feeling generous, he allowed Jeannie to play with her toys. Old food containers, spools of thread, cut up TV guides, and 2 plastic raincoats. Yay. He never turned the lights on in her room and kept curtains over the windows. Clark was sensitive to all types of noises and wouldn't let any member of his family speak without being beaten as a result. He even got rid of their television and radio. He would sit in the living room with a shotgun on his lap as a threat to his family. He only allowed Davis to leave the house to go to school, and when he returned each day, he would have to prove his identity at the door before being allowed to enter the home.
How are you gonna do that without speaking, Clark?
Like a secret knock. No one was ever allowed in the home, and their neighbors never met anyone in what they assumed was a family of 3. They did not know there was a 4th person living there.
Fair.
Clark never worried that Irene would disclose his abuse. She had sustained a severe head injury as a child, leaving her with neurological damage and degenerative vision problems in one eye. So when Irene first met Clark, she was happy. He was a great guy. But after they got married, a dark side of him came out. He no longer allowed her to leave her home, and he beat her constantly. Her eyesight continued to get worse, eventually resulting in severe cataracts and a detached retina. And she began to rely on her husband in almost every way. She could not see, pretty much. Clark would not allow Irene to contact her parents. He threatened to kill her if she tried to tell her parents, her friends, or police what was happening inside of their home. He said the same thing to Davis and eventually forced him to join in on Jeannie's abuse, which is what led to him eventually running away from home. Clark made a deal with Irene that if Genie lived to be 12 years old, she could take her away from the home, and he thought that that was a fair deal because he was like, surely she will die before then. However, Irene wouldn't end up taking Genie out of the home until she was almost 14 years old. How are we feeling so far? Pulse check. Questions, comments, concerns?
No.
Okay. Once the police were notified of Jeannie's arrival at the social services office, her parents were arrested, and Genie was sent to the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. When Genie got to the hospital, she immediately began meeting with Dr. David Rigler, a therapist who was the chief psychologist at the hospital and a psychology professor at the University of Southern California. He was accompanied by Howard Hansen, the head of the psychiatry division and an early expert on child abuse. The following day, they added a third physician, Dr. James Kent, who was also an advocate for child abuse awareness. Leading up to their examinations of Genie, the most they had to go off of was the information her parents gave at their police investigation. So they had a lot of questions they still wanted answered.
I just
Probably weren't going to get them
wonder.
answered by these people.
No. I just wonder, and it's obviously it's probably just a combination, but just wonder what was the most obvious thing to them when she came in the social services building, because it's being nonverbal isn't necessarily a sign of abuse. It could be for whatever reason. I don't know if she had or if it was just she was so thin. I know that she had muscle issues.
So she had very low gross motor function, and because of the confinement he put her in, she could not straighten any of her limbs, could not straighten her back or walk very well. But
I just wonder if
also,
at first I would look at that and just be like, oh, that's a physical disability.
well, and I think that
and so I wonder which part was oh no, we can't explain that. That's
right. Well, so I think that it's the social services or the social worker who called police was oh, this is a little girl, I think she might be autistic. And then when she started talking to Irene, she said who's this? How old is she? And she said 13. And she was like, that's not the right size for a 13-year-old.
Yeah.
And that's what made them call.
Yeah.
But I think originally she just thought this is a child who has some kind of cognitive disability or something that's causing her to be nonverbal or have gross motor reductions. But then hearing that she's twice the age they thought she was, they were like, oh god.
Yeah.
Soon after the doctors began their work with Genie, on November 17th, authorities released a photo of Genie to the press, and the public was enthralled. The media reached out to her parents for interviews, but Clark refused to speak to anyone. Crowds of reporters and concerned citizens showed up to the jail for a chance to talk to him, and 3 days after the public found out about Genie, Clark shot himself and died by suicide. He left behind
How
two
did he shoot
suicide
himself
notes.
in jail?
I wonder if at that point, because they had arrested them, but I wonder if he had been released for some reason, because he did not murder anyone.
Yeah, maybe the guards said, "There you go.
Sure.
Do with this weapon what you will."
So he left behind one suicide note for Davis, which read, quote, "Be a good boy, I love you," and one for police, which read, quote, "The world will never understand," end quote.
That's true. I fear that that's true.
With Clark gone, Jeannie's doctors wanted to shift focus to Jeannie's relationship with her mother, which was seeming to thrive without the threat of abuse. Davis claimed that Irene channeled all of her love and attention into Genie at this point and kind of left him on the outskirts. Dr. Hansen helped Irene find an attorney named John Miner to represent her in court. Miner had Irene testify that her partial blindness and the continued abuse from her husband kept her from being able to properly protect Genie from Clark, and the court dropped the charges against her and had her begin going to therapy at the same hospital where Genie was being treated. Jeannie's doctors were presented with a unique opportunity to study her behaviors and learn more about linguistically deprived children ethically. Before Genie, A few different studies on language deprivation had been conducted throughout history in an attempt to learn more about the fundamental characteristics of human nature as they relate to the origin of language. These were quickly ruled to be forbidden experiments, though, because these children were put into situations of complete social deprivation solely for the purpose of studying their reaction to being deprived of human contact, and the results that followed were a lot of psychological disturbance.
Yeah.
The first recorded study of this sort was carried out by an Egyptian pharaoh named Psamtik in the 600s BC. According to Greek historian Herodotus, Psamtik gave 2 newborn babies to a shepherd and instructed him not to allow anyone to speak to them. He could feed them and care for them, but the point of the experiment was to see if they could learn to speak without being spoken to. Through this,
I
Psamtik
feel like
hoped.
you know the answer.
Right.
I feel like
He didn't, because he thought he found something. Um,
it ain't
some
osmosis.
Somtic hoped that that if they weren't spoken to and they began speaking, he would be able to see what the natural root language of all human beings was. There is none.
Okay. Yeah.
Surprise. The shepherd reported that one of the children did learn to speak, calling out Bekos with outstretched arms. Gibberish, which
Well,
no
is it?
the men took to be the iteration of a Phrygian word meaning bread, and they were able to conclude that Phrygian was the original language of all people. I think I think we could do that with every baby.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to the noises they make, string them into graphemes, and then say, this is the language they're speaking.
Yeah. Dutch.
In the 13th century, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II conducted a similar experiment with infants raised without human interaction. He, too, wanted to see if children could develop linguistic features when their voice boxes were mature enough, even without hearing words spoken to them. Through this experiment, he believed that he would be able to conclude the language that Adam and Eve had spoken.
Ah.
This all goes back all the way to the top.
And like
Um,
how? Like it's just would be like natural and like ingrained
yeah,
in
like he was
them?
like, oh, so whatever language they speak is the language of instinct
Okay.
for humans, and if
And
that's
thus the language of sin.
and thus the language of the first humans ever to exist.
Okay.
A monk named Salimbene de Adam recorded Frederick II's experiments in his chronicles, strongly criticizing his handling of the experiments. Adam claimed that Frederick II had the babies tended to by foster mothers and nurses who would breastfeed them, bathe them, and care for them without speaking to them or interacting with them in any substantial way. He presumed that the babies would naturally speak Hebrew, as he thought that was likely the first language ever spoken, but he also considered the possibility of Greek, Latin, or Arabic, or that the children would just naturally develop the language of their parents, even without speaking to them or being raised by them.
Mm-hmm. It's in the DNA.
Unfortunately, yeah. Unfortunately, the children could not thrive without receiving any sort of spoken or body language. That's how it was worded. I'm assuming that means that they died.
Oh,
Um,
okay. They just didn't thrive.
I don't know exactly what that means. Um,
Yeah, we definitely knew they weren't thriving.
yeah. In Scotland, James IV sent 2 children off to be raised by a mute woman alone on the island of Inchkeith to find out if language was a learned behavior or an instinct. He claimed that the children successfully began to speak Hebrew, despite only being accompanied by a woman who could not speak. Similarly, Mughal, Emperor Akbar insisted that a study of children be raised by mute wet nurses. Unlike James IV, though, Akbar concluded that children had to be able to hear human speech in order to imitate it, and the children in his study grew up to be mute like the women who had raised them.
And then no other experiments were ever done because
Yep,
he found the answer.
that's true.
Nice.
That's when they said, we can't be doing this anymore. Um, Genie was the first modern feral child that psychologists were able to study. Prior to Genie, the most famous feral child was Victor of Aveyron. He was found in 1800 in France at the age of 9. He ran away several times after being captured, but was eventually taken in by a physician named Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard, who named him Victor and worked to teach Victor how to speak and read. He was never able to truly blend sounds and articulate words, but he did gain some social skills and physically interacting with other people, and he learned how to spell milk and oh god.
Incredible.
hmm Unlike Genie, Victor had been abandoned in nature. And there are several noted cases of children raised by monkeys, wolves, dogs, bears, sheep, cattle, and goats. But now, here was a child raised by no one, and psychologists were eager to study her continuing development. First, they observed the impact isolation had already had on Jeannie's physical, emotional, and academic development. They agreed that her case was the most severe case of child abuse they had ever seen, and they were concerned about if Genie would be successful moving forward. She showed signs of extreme malnourishment. She was pale and extremely small, weighing only 59 pounds, and she had a distended abdomen. Her hips were deformed, which I don't know why that pissed me off the most. I was like, she wore a damn corrective brace for those hips just for you to sit her on a potty her whole life and deform them again.
Yeah.
And her rib cage was undersized, giving her a bone age of an 11-year-old.
Just so interesting how her having special needs made her unwanted, and in turn you gave her more
Right.
special needs.
Yeah. The toilet she had been kept on had caused a thick callus and black bruising to form in a ring on her bottom. She was able to see fine up to 10 feet, which, not coincidentally, was the size of the room she was kept in. Anything more than 10 feet away caused Jeannie to lose focus. She could not stand up straight or fully straighten any of her limbs, and her gross motor development had been stunted, though her fine motor skills were surprisingly better.
Nice.
I'm guessing that's because her
Mm-hmm.
hands were able to move. She also did not have the energy or physical endurance to undergo these studies for very long, so they had to do it in short stints. She seemed unsure of most of the movements she made and walked with what what her doctors called a bunny walk,
Oh.
in which she held her hands up to her chest while she slowly and hesitatingly walked. So she walked with her hands like this. Um,
I was like,
she
oh, they
had
gave her bunnies?
no.
Nice.
She had severe deficits in sensory processing and could not integrate visual and tactile information. She could not chew and was completely incapable of swallowing anything except liquids.
Yeah.
When eating, she would let food sit in her mouth until it naturally broke down and to a liquid, and then she could swallow it. And with foods that were difficult to break down, if they sat in her mouth long enough without much happening, she would spit it out and mash it with her fingers. She did not show any significant responses to extreme temperatures, and she had no control over her bladder. The doctors tested Jeannie's cognitive abilities when she came to the hospital and found that she was functioning on the level of a 13-month-old. She is a 13-year-old. Next, doctors performed observations on Jeannie's behaviors and interactions with others. They noticed that Jeannie was extremely curious about some of the things she had never seen before, especially new objects and noises. They noted that when Jeannie heard a new sound, she would immediately seek its source. She all over the place, see where it's coming from. She was also interested in people, but doctors found that she didn't seem to be able to distinguish between different people.
Oh,
Even
interesting.
even Irene and Davis, like every kind of like facial blindness, I guess. Like everyone was
Interesting.
kind of the same to her. She would approach
Hmm.
anyone and walk with people, but originally would not let anyone touch her. Eventually, she would sit on her mother's lap for short periods of time, but seemed tense and anxious when doing so.
That's so interesting. I'm trying to think like what that would be. The like not right because it's like this is gonna sound so silly, but I'm trying to think like if you saw like three tigers, like
Hmm.
you would not like identify like the like and then you
Right.
saw them again after that, like you would not know like which
Yeah.
tiger was which. So it's like crazy to think that like
Hmm.
she just humans were like
Hmm.
something she had seen so little of that
Hmm.
like they all just like looked the same
Yeah.
and like
And
blurred together
eventually,
for
yeah.
her.
Eventually, as her
Sure.
mental age grows, like she is able to
And as she's
distinguish
like
between people.
around certain people like frequently, I'm sure she's around the same doctors frequently and the same her mom and Davis and like man,
Yeah.
that's crazy.
The doctors and hospital staff felt that Irene was unaware of Jeannie's personal preferences and emotions and didn't notice the effect she had on her. A lot of the times, Jeannie seemed to be very anxious around her mother, and she like didn't really care. Um, Jeannie continued not being able to truly socialize with others, and when she did, it was clear she had no situational awareness. Some examples of this include that she spat often, she blew her nose on random things, she took things from others, and she masturbated in public spaces often. There is some speculation because of this that Clark may have sexually abused her or forced Davis to perform sex acts with her, as
Mm.
it was noted that she also sometimes attempted to get older men in the hospital to engage in sex acts with her, but there was no way for them to definitively prove that that was what happened.
Oh, I was gonna say like the masturbating would not lead me to believe that. Like
No,
kids do that. Like with
no.
no education, they just
Right.
like touch themselves and realize
Yeah.
like that's nice. Um, but yeah, that would be interesting. Like she would have
Mhm.
no reason to connect like men
Right.
to like being the way that this can happen
Right.
unless like she's experienced that.
Yeah. Jeannie seemed to pick up on facial expressions and physical cues from others, somewhat understanding their meanings, and it was noted that she made good eye contact with others, but she herself was unable to make distinct facial expressions or body language and had a difficult time non-verbally expressing her needs. So
Yeah,
she
I
could tell,
wonder.
like,
Yeah, cause like,
yeah,
her dad would probably come in and she can, like, assess, like, anger,
right,
and then if her mom although it was, like, dark, obviously, but I was gonna say, like, if her mom was coming in at 11 o'clock with, like, nicer facial expressions, or even, like, upon meeting the social worker and stuff, like, all of a sudden, these people have different facial expressions than
yeah,
your dad always did with you, you
right.
know?
And in pictures of her, like from the hospital, she does have like the same facial expression in every single picture, but there's one picture of her when she gets to her second foster home where she's laughing, and it's like so nice that like to see
Yeah.
like in pictures how she grew.
'Cause I
Um,
never saw, like, positive
yeah,
facial expressions at her house.
right. As
On
I
the rare occasions
mentioned,
she saw any.
she was interested in hearing new sounds and learning where they came from, but was typically unresponsive when people tried to speak to her. She did not make any noises and only communicated through gestures or using objects. When she wanted to get someone's attention, she would push chairs or other heavy objects around to make noise. It was found that Genie never cried, but when she was upset, she would attack herself. The doctors weren't able to determine what triggered her outbursts, but they would often occur and or they would occur often and last until Jeannie physically became too tired to fight herself anymore.
What does that mean, attack herself?
Like she was like hitting herself,
Punching?
like scratching herself. Eventually, Jeannie was able to acquire a very small set of vocabulary. She responded only to her own name or the names of people she had become familiar with, and the only words she learned to speak while in the hospital were "stop it" and "no more."
Oh, self-advocacy.
She said, "How do I say no?"
How do I get you away from me?
It had become clear to doctors that Jeannie was not selectively mute. She just couldn't say any other words. And it didn't seem that her lack of language abilities had been from any sort of mental disabilities, since all of her medical records from childhood indicated that she was perfectly healthy. Instead, it became clear at this time to Jeannie's team that she had never acquired a first language because of the extreme isolation she had experienced and the fact that her father would not allow anyone to speak to her. Within a month of being at the hospital, Dr. J. Shirley, a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Oklahoma, who specialized in extreme social isolation, joined Jeannie's care team. What an interesting thing to
Specialize in?
specialize in. How many
Yeah.
things do you have to work on?
Hmm.
He found Jeannie's case to be the most extreme he had seen in his career.
I was gonna say, like, otherwise, and I don't know about like in the 70s, but I'm picturing like maybe you're studying like the isolation of like abuse victims, like
Yeah,
adult abuse victims
right.
that are like now
Or like
isolated from their
former
families,
cult members.
or right,
Yeah.
like cults, or like just high control groups. Like, I feel like rare, or maybe like homeschooled, extremely homeschooled, and like evangelical kids, but like I feel like you're probably rarely
Yeah,
working with children, and obviously rarely at this level.
right. Um, when he ran tests on Jeannie, he wanted to see if Jeannie's socialization problems were caused by nature or nurture.
I can tell you.
He, yeah, he tested her for autism, brain damage, or other mental health problems. He found that she was not autistic and she did not have brain damage. She had high levels of emotional disturbance, but had a lack of behavioral defense mechanisms.
How do you even test for autism though in like that, in that, I don't know, like at that point, like
Yeah,
I feel like you, or like test for anything that isn't like a straight up like freaking blood test, because it's
because
like
like even
so much of her
right,
is
I was
just who
gonna
she
say
is now. I don't
even
know.
in 2024, um, tests for autism screeners are based in like behaviors. Like
Hmm.
you get the
Not like a
teachers to,
gene.
yeah, you get teachers to fill them out, parents to fill them out, and it's a list of behaviors
Hmm.
that you score the child on. So like it sounds like she would have
Well, and that's
somewhat of
really
it.
interesting though, because that means that like she had like a stunning lack of those behaviors. If
Right.
you can test her and say like she does not have autism, given like the nonverbal, given like
Hmm.
that means that like whatever, anything outside of like just what the abuse would cause, there was nothing else.
Yeah.
And like that's wild.
Dr. Shirley also found that Jeannie had a significantly reduced amount of REM sleep and a high number of sleep spindles. He was able to conclude that Jeannie did have a cognitive disability from birth based on those sleep patterns.
Interesting.
Her other
That doesn't
doctors,
seem like yeah,
they
obviously I don't
said
know what you're
basically
about to
he
say,
said
but
that
it's
like
like, couldn't her sleep just be like abnormal because of her, like I don't know.
sleep spindles and lack of REM sleep are evidence of like a cognitive disability. But the other doctors weren't sure because she was progressing so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Dr. Susan Curtis explained that Jeannie made a year's worth of developmental progress for every calendar year after she was rescued from her father's home. So every year she made a year's worth of progress, starting at around the development of a 1-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Curtis felt that this was evidence that Jeannie could not have been disabled from birth because she wouldn't be progressing this rapidly if she had been, and that instead it was her isolation that had decreased her functionality. Jeannie progressed really well once she was in the hospital. Within a few days, she learned how to get dressed by herself and how to go to the toilet when needed. Dr. Kent began taking her on walks and to appointments because he felt it would be important for her to have a steady, familiar presence in her life in light of the number of people who had joined her team and were studying her. There's like so many people. Jeannie began putting on weight and became more confident in her movements and hand-eye coordination. When she first arrived, she really only communicated through tantrums and through puppets. Eventually, she began collecting objects, specifically anything made of a colorful plastic material. They found that her favorite objects were beach pails, and they would give them to her to bring her out of a tantrum. However, they also noticed that she was extremely possessive of her items, and touching one could incite a tantrum.
Mm.
Jeannie continued to progress and soon began to form relationships with other people. About a month into her hospital stay, her team noticed that Jeannie responded positively to seeing familiar adults such as her mother, Dr. Kent, and other hospital staff. She would greet them energetically, and then when they tried to leave, she would try to get them to stay. It was noted that Jeannie enjoyed dropping and breaking small objects or watching others do the same thing, which like babies love that shit.
Mm-hmm.
Like you break
Toddlers.
something in front of a toddler and
Yeah.
it's performance art.
Mm-hmm.
Um she loved classical music played on the piano. If music was played through a recording or the piano was used to play anything other than classical music, Jeannie would communicate that she wanted it to be changed to classical music from the piano.
Stop that.
No more.
This is trash.
In December, just 2 months after arriving at the hospital, Dr. Kent and David Rigler obtained a small grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to begin conducting research studies on Jeannie. In January, they administered a Jessel developmental evaluation on Jeannie and found her developmental level to be that of a 2-year-old.
Heck
They
yeah,
found
girl.
that they found that her brain was fully intact and was left hemisphere dominant. The following month, she had grown to the level of a 3-year-old. And in a
That
few
sounds like more than
portions,
a year per
I
year.
know. In a few portions of the test, she was showing normal 12 to 13-year-old levels and was even beginning to attempt to mimic speech sounds.
Whoa.
In March, more tests run on Jeannie showed that she had normal hearing in both ears, but showed a preference for identifying sounds with her left ear, which they said is very common in people who are right-handed.
Oh.
So this proved to the doctors that Jeannie had been developing normally as a right-handed person, but the isolation she went through caused an imbalance between her brain hemispheres because she wasn't receiving any auditory stimuli. This basically there was a lot of information on that, but basically this means that her language function never fully formed.
Yeah.
Um Within just a few more months, Jeannie's score had increased again to show that she was functioning at the level of an almost 5-year-old. Around this time, a small earthquake struck Los Angeles, and Jeannie ran into the kitchen of the hospital and attempted to speak to some of the cooks to let them know she was frightened, which was the first time she had been readily verbal and sought out comfort from someone familiar.
Ah, I feel like that's almost like a bigger deal than like the speaking. To
Yeah.
say like something's happening. I should like find a human
Right.
person to like help me or
And
to
like
like
they said
be
that,
near me.
yeah, they said that she had been like spending time in the kitchen and like gotten to know the people who cooked at the hospital. So like the fact that she like thought about who to go
Those are my
to. Yeah.
people. Yeah.
Yeah. She did still have trouble communicating with others, feeling uncomfortable in large crowds and throwing tantrums, still like a small child.
Me
On one
too, girl.
occasion, a mantrum. On
Mhm.
one occasion, she attacked another girl because Jeannie thought she was wearing her hospital gown. And like I said, she was very possessive of her
Mhm.
things. In May, Dr. Curtis began to work with Jeannie daily and noticed that her nonverbal communication was profound. She noted that Jeannie could convince complete strangers to give her things or buy her things simply because they could sense she wanted it.
Heck yeah,
So
girl.
once a young boy on the street passed by Jeannie and just handed her his toy fire truck and walked off. And another time, a woman did the same thing with her entire purse.
Get your bag, girl.
I
Literally.
swear. This is actually a long con. Um, by this time, her mental age progressed again to that of a 5 to 8 year old.
She's like,
She was
not only was I not born with cognitive impairments, I was born a fucking genius, and I've been fooling all of you.
we love her. We love her. She said, "I've been getting away with masturbating in public, smashing shit for
Mhm.
fun. I get whatever music I want played in the hospital,
Mhm.
and somebody just gave me their whole fucking purse."
Heck yeah.
We love her. I like seriously like I think because like of being a teacher, I'm like just like listening to her progress as it goes. I'm like, yes, girl, like come
Mhm.
on, you're doing the damn thing. Um, she
All
was
while Clark is dead, as it should be.
She was believed to be in the concrete operational stage of development because she understood object permanence, could imitate others, and had higher endurance than when she had arrived at the hospital. However, she still had abnormal social behaviors and rarely communicated with anyone outside of her doctors, who were much older than her. Not that there's anything like wrong with her doctors being older than her because she's a
Mhm.
child, but like basically they just said like she didn't have any like true peers
Sure.
or like friends.
So it's like even if she is like learning language or whatever,
Yeah,
like she's now learning it from like professionals and like
right.
adults and like
And her
she's not
interactions,
getting any sort of like
yeah,
gradual like steps between. It's like going from
right,
speaking to no one to
yeah,
speaking to people that she actually shouldn't even
right.
be on the same like
And
vocabulary with.
I know we've established that she's not autistic, but in like children with autism, that is like one of the things that's on an autism screener is like, are their relationships more comfortable with people their own age
Mhm.
or people younger than them or people older than them? Like, who are they most comfortable with? Because a
Yeah.
lot of times, autistic children feel more comfortable with adults, socializing with adults than
Yeah.
with peers. Over time, Jeannie's vocabulary expanded, and by 1975, she was able to name most of the objects she saw day to day. However, her grammar and sentence structure were weak. For example, she might mix up you and me, saying Mama love you instead of Mama loves me. She was taught how to use certain sentences that were necessary, like may I have, when purchasing something. They also noted that Jeannie's voice was exceptionally high and soft.
Mhm. I
Eventually,
think
Jeannie,
that the you and me thing's also common. Like I had
yes.
a toddler here not long
Hmm.
ago, and I would say, "Who are you?" And she would say, "You." And
Well, and
and
like
then like me, and like she's.
pronouns are very easily mixed up, especially in like children who are learning a second language. So
Mhm.
like students who are like English language learners, a lot of time you'll hear them say like call everyone she. Like I had a
Mhm.
little girl in my class, every time she's talking about her brother, she would say she.
Mhm.
Be like, I know your brother.
But it's like when you say to someone, "You, what do you want? What are
Yeah.
you doing? What do you?" And they're thinking like they're
Right.
talking to me,
Right.
Katie, so then you
Right.
like associate, like I
Right.
must be you.
Right. There's a little girl in my class, and people would get mad at her because she would say, like, she would, like, she had a lot of, like, behavioral issues. But, like, one specific incident, like, she hit someone,
Mm-hmm.
and said, she said, like, she came up to me and she said, "You hit her." I
Oh.
said, "Did I?" But I knew what she meant, because that's how she talks. And I said, "I know you did." And she said, "You say sorry?" I said, "You can say sorry." She said, "You say sorry now." And, like, just, that's how she
Yeah.
did it every time. Um, Eventually, Jeannie began to speak about her childhood in short phrases, saying, quote, "Father hit arm, big wood, Jeannie cry, not spit, father hit face, spit, father hit big stick, father is angry, father hit Jeannie big stick, father take piece wood, hit cry, father make me cry, father is dead," end quote.
Yeah, he is.
The father is dead part, they said that she was very, like, she would ask about him a lot, and, like, if he was coming to get her, and that they said that they worked for a very long time to, like, confirm in her mind that he was dead. um Despite being able to verbally communicate, Jeannie preferred to and excelled in communicating nonverbally, and was eventually able to learn sign language. By 1972, Jeannie was functioning at the level of an 8-year-old, and by 1977, she functioned as a 10-year-old. Get it, girl. In 1971, Jeannie had gone to live in her first hospital home, her first foster home.
Mm-hmm.
Jenna Butler convinced the hospital staff that, I say convinced because I think this woman's a little sketchy, that Jeannie may have rubella, and that it would be best for her to come to Butler's house for full-time care, as isolation for her illness would damage her social progress. That's
But
true, but she might not
what
have
are
rubella.
you, a rubella specialist?
Right. During her time living with Butler, Jeannie went through puberty, was fully potty trained, and got over her fear of dogs for the most part by watching reruns of Lassie and playing with toy dogs.
I wonder if there's, we can cut this if this is stupid, but I really am just thinking like in these situations, like I wonder if there's any benefit to like puberty blockers.
Mm-hmm.
Just in that like that has got to be like so jarring, and like
Mm-hmm.
physically she's not like, you know, like up to like weights like weight that
Right.
she's supposed to be and like whatever.
Right.
So I just like wonder how like jarring that is to be like acting as a 10-year-old, or at this point still like an 8-year-old,
Mm-hmm.
and then now you're like, yeah, I don't know,
Yeah.
like getting a period like that. Oof.
Yeah. She also stopped attacking herself when she was angry, and was able to instead take her frustration out on objects, or even by using her limited oral language. Irene continued to visit Jeannie and even hoped to bring her to live with her now that she had received corrective eye surgery and was becoming more independent.
Okay, girl.
Everyone, everyone is looking up, baby. However, Butler began to prevent Jeannie from having visitors, including her own mother, citing that Jeannie was overwhelmed by them. Some people believed that Butler had ulterior motives for keeping Jeannie to herself, and some of her colleagues claimed to have overheard her saying that she would be the next Anne Sullivan and would make Jeannie famous. Absolutely wild thing to say out loud.
Mm-hmm. Who's Anne Sullivan?
Helen Keller's teacher.
Oh. But make her famous how? Because if you're like isolating her, like she's not gonna.
Like, she's like, Jeannie's the next Helen Keller, and I'm the next Anne Sullivan.
Right, but like you'd have to like get her performing well, right?
Yeah.
To be the next Helen Keller. So like what are you doing for her?
Well,
Come on.
I think she just didn't want anyone to, like, she didn't want her mom there. She didn't want her to take her.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um In August, Butler's application for foster custody of Genie was rejected, and Genie was sent to live. I lost my place. Instead, with Dr. Brigler and his wife Marilyn, who had worked as a social worker and a teacher.
Cute.
Now living with the Wrigglers, Jeannie's mother was allowed to visit her. They went out once a week to parks or to restaurants together. Irene felt that the Wrigglers were condescending to her at times, but Jeannie's team felt that this was likely only as a result of the fact that Irene was in denial of Jeannie's condition and the fact that she may have contributed to it in some way. They also felt that when asked about Jeannie's upbringing, Irene would simply tell stakeholders what they wanted to hear to avoid judgment. So they're like kind of naturally condescending to her because like she wasn't being honest.
Yeah.
After living with the Wrigglers, Jeannie began to enjoy things like painting her nails and going to school.
Cutie.
Her team lost funding after interest surrounding the research declined and criticism began to come in that the research was coming at the expense of Jeannie's well-being. Some researchers worried that Jeannie would associate her worth and ability to receive love and attention with her success in language acquisition. They thought like that if she's like getting all of these rewards for like from her doctors for speaking and things, that she would think that she had to do it all the time.
I actually think that's fair, and I actually think like how, I don't know if this is gonna make sense, but like how good for her that she's reached a point in her life where like we can now be concerned about these like deeper things,
Right.
like her worth and like
Right.
what it's attached to. And it's like before it was like, how does this girl like survive?
Right.
Now it's like, hey, maybe she's gonna start thinking like she has to do this for
Right.
love. And like
Right.
how nice that we're like moving to like emotional concerns for her now.
Yeah. Others were concerned about the blurred lines between Jeannie's doctors and her caretakers, given that her first two foster homes were with people on her care team. The Wrigglers argued that they truly loved Jeannie, but also that they didn't want to overstep with Irene still being in her life. And they had kids of their own. So they were like, we feel like guardians to Jeannie. We don't feel like parents to Jeannie because she has a parent.
Yeah.
However, some people accuse the Wrigglers of viewing Jeannie primarily as like a lab rat, and they implied that they abandoned her care once they lost funding. I don't know that that's true. Marilyn, like especially like got Jeannie into her first nursery school and then into her first school for the cognitively impaired. Jeannie has continued going to schools for the cognitively impaired and stay in adult foster homes. Her mother died in 2013 at the age of 87, and her brother died in 2011. So Jeannie is currently a ward of the state, and as of 2016, she was living a happy and healthy life in Los Angeles, but she enjoys her privacy. So that is the latest we have on her.
Nice.
And good for her.
Good for her.
Because that's what she wants.
Good for you, girl. Do we know how Davis died? Before their mom?
No. I think because, like, of how much attention Irene gave to Jeannie once she was able to, he kind of lost touch with them.
Okay. Wow.
A lot of information, but
That was good.
but so proud of her.
Yeah. A happy ending.
Go Jeannie. I don't know why. I guess, I mean, I do know why. They changed her name because she was like a minor when all this stuff came out. But she just stuck with it, I guess.
Oh, so she does go by Genie, though.
Yeah.
Okay.
She does. Genie Wiley.
Nice.
And she's so cute. And there is a picture or maybe a couple pictures online from before her mom died of her and her mom with like Genie as an adult.
Yeah. Cute.
And they're great.
Cute.
Good job.
Woo.
Everybody. Yeah. I get jazzed about language and people
Yeah.
learning to read and speak correctly.
Yeah.
And so I'm very happy for her. But also
Yeah.
a crime. And also her dad did murder someone. A baby. Their
Yeah.
first baby.
Yeah. Fair.
He put her in the garage.
At the very least, manslaughtered her.
Right. At the tender age of 10, what do we say, 10 weeks, 10 months?
Yeah, I don't remember. 10
Overnight.
months. Yeah.
So
Wild.
he got what he deserved.
Yeah.
And I think at first I was like going back and forth on the mom, but I think like the fact that her whole care team and like lawyers and the judge were like that she truly couldn't have helped her out of that situation
Mm-hmm.
in her conditions, and the fact that she was there for her like ever since, like
Yeah.
good for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like that happens with just like mothers
Yeah.
when the father is an abuser anyway, then add
Right.
to it that her mom had like a TBI and
Right.
like, you know,
Couldn't
just
see very
yeah.
well. Yeah. And it was getting worse because she was being beaten
Yeah.
consistently. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's it.
Nice.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.